COMPAS, or Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, is an ongoing program of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, of which I'm a member of the steering committee. My name's Emma Saunders-Hastings. I'll be moderating today. And its mission is to organize a series of conversations on important social and political issues across disagreements in a civil and constructive way. If you are interested in the past themes that we've covered in COMPAS, they include topics like immigration, what is America, economic inequality, technology, and in the lobby of Hopkins Hall, you can visit a retrospective exhibition covering the last 10 years of the COMPAS program. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, and so we're using the occasion to revisit past themes and questions and see what's changed since we first took them up. So Samuel Bagg, who is our guest today and we're delighted to host, is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of South Carolina. He's also taught at Oxford, at McGill University, and at Duke University, where he received his PhD. So his work on democracy bridges normative and empirical questions in ways that I've learned a lot from and that I'm really excited to bring to OSU today. In addition to the new book, which again I highly commend to you, his work has appeared in many of the top political science journals, including the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics. We also have two respondents from OSU, two of my colleagues who've agreed to provide commentary on some of the arguments that Professor Bagg will make today. Naomi Scheinerman is an assistant professor in the bioethics department and the Department of Biomedical Education and Anatomy, but she's also a political and democratic theorist with particular expertise in the area of deliberative democracy, something that Professor Bagg's work addresses as well. Finally, Vladimir Kogan is a professor of political science at OSU. I think I know at least a few people in the room who know him as a teacher. His research focuses on the intersection of politics and public policy, especially in areas relating to urban policy and education. And so he's currently working on a book on education policy in the US called No Adult Left Behind, which hopefully we'll do events on soon. So without any further throat clearing, I'm going to give Professor Samuel Bagg the floor to talk about some of the key arguments in his new book and how they bear on questions of threats to democracy and what we might do about them.
All right, thanks so much. Can everybody hear me all right? Perfect. So I'm going to be talking today about some of the arguments from my book, as Emma was saying, The Dispersion of Power, which actually has recently come out in the UK, and it's coming out soon in the US. The main idea of the book is that the ways we usually think about democracy, what it is, why it matters, how to make it better, those habits of thought are actually getting in our way, making it harder for us to defend and enrich democracy. And so I propose a different way of thinking about it, which can offer better guidance, I think. What I'm going to do today is pull out a couple of basic points from that larger project. First, the American government is captured in many consequential ways by oligarchic elites. Second, the proposals you typically hear as solutions are not going to cut it. And third, the most important thing we have to do instead is build organized forms of collective countervailing power among ordinary people. All right, so let's start with this first claim about capture. How many of you have seen this image before? Okay, a lot of you. It's a political cartoon from 1904. And it depicts the stranglehold that companies like Standard Oil had over American government during the Gilded Age, which you might think of as a textbook case of oligarchic capture. More formally, here are the definitions I use when I'm talking about these concepts, but the main thing to keep in mind for today is that oligarchic capture happens when many elements, not necessarily all the elements of a state, but many elements of state power serve the interests of an ultra-wealthy elite. And I think that does apply to the contemporary United States. Now, the first thing you probably think of when you hear that is the idea of money in politics, right? In other words, campaign donations, super PACs, the fundraising imperative, Citizens United, all that good stuff. These are the most visible manifestations or mechanisms of oligarchic capture. They're also, I think, the least important mechanisms. The real action, it seems to me, is elsewhere. The main reason that state policy serves oligarchic interests so reliably is not because they're able to sway elections or buy off candidates. What's more important than the most visible money in politics, in my view, is the influence of wealth behind the scenes, the money behind politics, if you will. So you can think about it this way. The visible part of the policymaking process is when parties campaign, get elected, and then make laws in Congress. And that's where the stereotypical money in politics comes in. But the thing is, that's only a small part of the story. And in fact, this visible realm, despite all the real problems with money in politics, this is actually the realm where things are most equal, relatively speaking. At least everyone has an equal vote in these elections. At least you can see what's going on. That's not true of the agenda-setting phase, where the most basic terms of political life are set. And a great deal of the oligarchs' power lies here in the fact that issues which would really threaten their power never even make it onto the agenda in the first place. For instance, why do we tax income rather than wealth? Wealth is far more unevenly distributed. There's a lot more of it. Taxing it even a little bit could pay for a hell of a lot of stuff that we want to do. But it's not even on the table, really. And then there's everything that happens after the visible part of the process. Suppose we manage to pass a law that challenges oligarchic power in some way. Does the Supreme Court let it stand? How is it enforced? Bureaucrats often have social ties to wealthy elites. They get trained at the same law schools and business schools. They get job offers after they finish their stint in government. So they may not want to enforce the rules against oligarchs. And even if they wanted to, they might not have the resources to win in court against dozens of high-paid lawyers that will inevitably be put in the employ of the oligarchs. We can call this the implementation phase, and capture is really important in this realm too. Because it's in these realms of money behind politics, without visibility, without formal equality, that's where outcomes are even more powerfully driven by what I call organizational capacity. In other words, who has the incentive and the means to be able to find these hidden channels of influence and exploit them for all they're worth. This capacity is, of course, highly unequally distributed. Whereas, formal political power is relatively equally distributed. This organizational capacity is not at all. How exactly do oligarchs use, organizational capacity to get their way? I've listed 4 terms here from political science describing some of the mechanisms I think are especially important, but I'm not going to get into the details here because for me, the specific mechanisms actually aren't the most important thing. The point is that when you have profound asymmetries of background power, those inevitably are going to make their way into the outcomes one way or another. So, what are the outcomes that I'm talking about? I'm glad you asked. I've already mentioned taxes, and this is one area where the more you look into it, the more you just kind of start to lose your mind. There's just so much wealth being hidden, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. One estimate puts the total globally at $7.6 trillion, trillion with a T, which amounts to almost 10% of all global wealth, all of it. And governments do basically nothing about this. What about monetary policy? Everybody knows it's the most important single factor in the shape of the economy, but almost no one talks about how the choices that are made by the Fed have massive consequences for the distribution of wealth and power between investors on the one hand and workers on the other. And you won't be surprised to hear whose interests are usually favored by the Fed, a group of bankers accountable to bankers. Then there's the fact that the way the government defines and enforces things like corporate law, labor law, property law, actually encourages the concentration of decision-making in giant corporations rather than distributing that power among smaller businesses and collections of businesses. It's what's illegal for small businesses to do if they are separate is actually legal for giant corporations to do within a corporation. Financial regulation. Wait, I skipped one. Intellectual property is an especially egregious case. It's supposed to incentivize innovation, but in practice it's so warped by corporate lobbying that it ends up squashing innovation, and instead simply inflating the profits of established firms, rentiers, and even patent trolls. Financial regulation is it favors oligarchic elites so pervasively, it's hard to choose one area to focus on, but a lot of it boils down to this. The rules, at least as they're actually enforced, allow financial elites to take incredible risks with other people's money and reap ungodly rewards for themselves when they're successful, but then shift the burdens onto the public when they fail. The public has to foot the bill. The healthcare system is also structured in countless ways to effectively subsidize the profits of pharmaceutical and insurance companies, inflate the salaries of doctors, all at the expense of patients. It's no surprise that Americans spend more per capita to get worse outcomes than nearly every other developed country. Then there's the billions of dollars in subsidies the federal government grants to gigantic factory farms, the way it makes smaller operations difficult to maintain. Don't forget the trillions that are spent, again, trillions with a T, to fight catastrophic decades-long wars and develop weapon systems that don't even work, all to ensure that the shareholders of Raytheon and Halliburton can make impossibly high returns. Even laws that were intended, when they were passed, to curb the power of these oligarchic elites and the world's most powerful corporations, like antitrust, they're not applied today to address the obvious dangers of tech giants eating up all their competitors. What about fossil fuels? More subsidies here, again, in the trillions with a T. In this case, granted to the people whose obscene wealth comes from their extraordinary dedication to hastening the apocalypse. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more literal example of state power serving oligarchic interests in the dozens of military interventions undertaken by the US government to essentially protect the capital investments of private US citizens. Are you getting the picture yet? Oh, sorry, I guess I skipped one there. Yeah, there, banana republics, et cetera, okay. So the list goes on and on and on and on, right? Probably you know all this stuff, but hopefully the effect is to, there's a lot of this going on. And it's reflected, obviously, in the bigger picture of ballooning inequality, right? There's a reason they call our age the new Gilded Age. This graph is from Thomas Piketty's book, showing that the top decile takes home nearly 50% of national income. You're probably familiar with graphs like this by now. Here's another one showing wealth instead. And remember, wealth is far more unequally distributed than income. In the past 50 years, it's become much, much more unequally distributed. Since 1983, median family income has barely budged, whereas wealth has barely budged, and the wealth of the top 1% has more than tripled, right? And that's not even counting the wealth that's hidden in offshore accounts, which, as we know, is quite large. Okay, so that's where we are. It won't be news to many of you. The question is, what do we do about it? And here's one idea that you've probably heard, right? The problem lies in the people who are supposed to be representing us. They're not responsive enough to the demands of ordinary people. And if that's right, all we need to do is to fix the electoral process and the two-party system, perhaps. Or maybe the problem is we need to get money out of politics. Or perhaps just let the people rule directly through things like referendums, right? And if that's the problem, bam, like any of those solutions could fix it. As you can probably tell, though, I'm not convinced by this approach. And here's why. It's not that I don't think these things could help. They could, I think, on the margins, but they're only tackling the visible spectrum here. They're stuck on fixing the problem of money in politics, not the real problems of money behind politics. They're not tackling the underlying inequalities of organizational capacity, the fact that wealthy elites have such vast advantages in fighting all of these battles that happen behind the scenes. Here's the other problem. If we look back at this list of issues, it's not necessarily true that representatives are ignoring popular demands for action and siding with the oligarchs instead. There's a few issues like that, but for the most part, people just don't know enough about these policy areas to have an opinion about them or care enough about them. And how could they? A lot of this is really complex, arcane stuff. Most of it's not talked about, and they have no incentive to find out. But that's the thing about oligarchs. They do have strong incentives to find out what will serve their interests in these areas, and they certainly have the means to pursue those interests and make sure that that is what happens. So unfortunately, even if progressive reformers got every item on their wish list, I just don't think it would make that big of a dent in the extent of oligarchic capture. Because electoral reforms don't address the root cause. In other words, underlying imbalances of organizational capacity. So what else could we do? Well, over the last 100 years or so, there's been a number of different approaches that have converged on this idea that the answer lies in more participatory inclusion, basically giving ordinary people more direct input into a wider range of decision-making processes through things like collaborative governance, participatory budgeting, intra-party democracy, deliberative mini-publics. All of these are different ways of getting more ordinary people involved outside of that visible spectrum, which makes a lot of sense, actually, given the picture that I've drawn. And in theory, that is the right approach. But the problem is that these reforms, as they're most often implemented, don't actually put ordinary people on an equal footing with the oligarchs. It's kind of just throwing people in their individual capacity into forms where they haven't been before, but they're still unorganized and they still don't have any resources. So maybe it feels democratic that they're there. They're in these forums and realms where they haven't been included before. They're participating, but And maybe it is better on the whole that they're there, rather than not having any access at all. But they're still going to be majorly outflanked, outgunned by the oligarchs, who still have all the organizational capacity. And in fact, a lot of the time, oligarchs actually like these forums because they can still manage the outcomes in various ways, but now those outcomes have the sheen of democratic legitimacy, so they don't raise as much ire or contestation. It looks like democracy, it even feels like democracy to some of the participants, but the oligarchs are still ultimately getting their way. So to summarize, these forums are still very much open to capture by wealthy elites. And in fact, the pretense that these are neutral, even collaborative spaces can actually help to conceal the existence of real conflicts. Meanwhile, even in the best case scenario, right, there's still many other areas of capture that are left entirely untouched. So just to get a sense of what I'm talking about here, we can look at two cases. The first is consultative procedures set up by the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969. Unlike earlier accounts of the Administrative Procedures Act and so on, the NEPA mandated that agencies that were seeking to do some project have to seek out and account for the views of those who were most likely to be affected by whatever development, extractive projects that they were considering. And of course, this sounds like a great idea, again, in theory. In practice, though, NEPA procedures are most often used to ensure compliance with projects that are basically going to go forward no matter what, right? They gather information on potential opponents, maybe they buy them off or divert their energy towards consultative processes which have essentially no hope of halting the momentum behind their projects. All the while, they're building evidence for their legal defense in case they're challenged in court. As another example, consider the way that French President Emmanuel Macron has employed participatory inclusion to diffuse the popular energy of the Yellow Vests movement. His first step was to initiate a nationwide debate involving 10,000 local meetings and 2 million online comments. He then created a citizens' convention for climate composed of 150 randomly selected citizens and promised that its recommendations would be put directly to the people in a referendum. This is widely celebrated by advocates of deliberative participatory democracy. Alas, when their proposals ended up threatening elite interests, he simply reneged on this promise and watered down their demands quite significantly. That's typical of elite commitments to these kinds of processes, right? They want them when they think it makes them look good, but in the end, they're disposable if it ends up threatening their interests. And because they weren't actually organized, right, the Citizens Convention for Climate was not able to do anything about this, right, this reneging on this promise. Okay, so what do I think we should do instead? In the book, I talk about three main things. The first is substantive policy to redistribute resources and coordination capacity. In a way, that's the ultimate goal, right? But it's also fairly obvious, so I don't think we're likely to, and I also don't think we're likely to get very far with this unless we also make progress on other fronts. So I'm not going to say much more about that now. The second is procedural reforms designed specifically to insulate public power from oligarchic capture. And these can often look quite similar to what I've called participatory inclusion. So this can, this is a bit specific, but the differences here matter, right? Because if you make participation and inclusion the goal as such, you're going to end up with the fake stuff, right? The stuff that is easy to capture. If you just invite people to participate in the collaborative process on supposedly neutral terms, but the agenda is tightly circumscribed in advance, and you're up against oligarchs with all the power and money in the world, that's not actually a neutral space. What you're going to get, unsurprisingly, is outcomes that favor people with the most organizational capacity, just like you already do. Instead, you've got to make the goal of these procedural reforms resisting oligarchic capture. You've got to make that explicit, and then design institutions with that in mind, institutions that expose rather than concealing conflicts of interest, and minimize the role of research advantages to whatever extent that's possible. This is really difficult. I do think that there are some strategies that do better on this, relatively speaking, than others. But really, the most important thing is the development of collective countervailing power. Because unless ordinary people are able to develop some organizational capacity of their own, even the most carefully designed forums aren't going to actually put them on equal footing with oligarchs, right? So with the time I have remaining, I'm going to say a few more things about this third strategy. To start with, remember that the most important thing, remember that the fundamental fact that we're responding to is that these those with wealth and power, the oligarchic elites, they have all the advantages when it comes to organizing, fighting, bargaining over policy outcomes in all this money in the spaces behind politics, right? The only advantage that they don't have is numbers. So that's more or less where the action is going to be for countervailing power. And in particular, in order to pose a real counterweight, to actually extract real concessions from wealthy elites, ordinary people have to be able to threaten their real material interests. Nothing else is going to move the needle. And that's extremely difficult to do. You have to get people to act collectively, often at substantial personal cost, over long periods of time, because wealthy elites can always afford to wait, almost always. Time is going to be on their side. And so the question is, how do you do that? How do you get people to commit themselves to this collective project? That's what I see as the really core question of countervailing power. The answer that I find most promising is what some people have called organizing for power. I get the phrase from Jane McAlevey, but it builds on a number of different traditions. One of these is a kind of union organizing that was practiced by the early Congress of Industrial Organization, CIO. That's McAlevey's model. Another is the kind of community organizing pioneered by Saul Alinsky, his contemporary heirs in the Industrial Areas Foundation. A third is the tradition of movement organizing, which has its origins in the civil rights movement, figures like Ella Baker, Septima Clark, and it's carried forward today by groups like the Movement for Black Lives. And despite the many differences between them, I find that organizers in these traditions converge on a remarkable number of commitments, which can tell us a lot about how to build the sort of countervailing power we need to rescue democracy from oligarchic capture. The first thing they converge on is that they're careful to separate what they do from much of what traditionally goes on in the name of activism. For instance, organizing is distinct from advocacy, in which small communities of highly committed activists persuade political leaders to adopt certain reforms through rational, persuasive, deliberative argument. That can get certain kinds of reforms passed, but its ability to achieve deeper changes that actually threaten elite interests is going to be severely limited because it does not make use of the power of numbers. So the first key feature of organizing is that it's based on mass collective action. This, in turn, means that organizers have to bring in people who are not already on their side, right? They have to get opponents from the union to go on strike. They have to get disengaged people to become political. It can't just be about the usual suspects, the self-identified activists. Large numbers mean ordinary people, actual ordinary people. And I know Ben probably has some thoughts about that, but okay, so now certain forms of mobilization can do this, too. The classic example is you whip up the rage machine, you get thousands, even millions of people to show up at a protest in their pink hats or whatever it is. But organizing is distinct from mobilization, too. Mobilization uses the power of large numbers, but it's in a disorganized way that can't really be sustained over long periods of time. By contrast, organizing has to have a really long time horizon. It has to be sustainable over a very long period. It can't just be a one-off mobilization for a rally or a protest. Or again, elites just shrug it off, wait it out. It won't threaten their interests. Finally, organizers are relentlessly focused on the power structure and the opportunities that are afforded by it. Who are the power brokers? More importantly, what kinds of power can ordinary people wield plausibly, if organized effectively, which would enable them to force their demands upon those power brokers? This is maybe the trickiest part, because there aren't actually that many kinds of power that ordinary people can wield like this. So I'm going to skip the slides where I talk about what some of those kinds of power are. Each of them has advantages and disadvantages, but I'm running low on time, so I'm going to go to the next, the last bit, where so talk about what I think the key lessons of studying this are. So remember, the reason it's so hard to get effective countervailing power is that you need to be able to sustain commitment from large numbers of people over a long period of time, right? They have to make real sacrifices, take real risks. They're going to impose real costs. Think about a workplace strike, a rent strike, a boycott, effective grassroots political campaign. You need lots of people devoting lots of time and energy and often taking risks. So first, in order to get people involved and committed over the long term, you have to win things. This is a common insight of all these traditions. You have to identify things that might feasibly be able to win, using real forms of power that you can actually build and deploy that will be sufficient to force opponents to make those concessions. You have to win sometimes. Not all the time, but you have to win sometimes. This doesn't mean goals can't be ambitious. They can and they should be, but they have to at least be conceivably within your reach if you do the right work, build the right alliances, get enough participation. it also doesn't mean you can't have a long-term vision, but it has to be broken down into shorter-term objectives that are achievable. Because, a core of committed activists may be willing to stay true to the cause in the face of constant failure, but you're never going to build a mass movement if it never wins. Second, you have to shift identities. For the organizers I'm drawing on, this is absolutely the crucial point. You have to get people to see themselves as effective political agents, getting to feel solidarity with one another, right? In order to pull off costly collective actions, you need people to become the kinds of people who do things like participate in costly collective actions. And that's not who most people are, at least initially. All that's extremely difficult, right? What we learn from political psychology is that social identity, group identity, is really important for political behavior, but it's also really hard to change. And ultimately, that is what distinguishes organizing from other forms of popular participation that are discussed in democratic theory and other forms of activism that are popular. Organizing is directed at changing identity, a changing subjectivity. And the model of organizing for power involves practices that are actually up to that challenge. It's not about trying to change people's minds by deliberating with them for an hour in a participatory budgeting meeting, for instance. It's not about symbolic protests in the name of ideological purity. It's about building solidarity with a wide range of people over weeks, months, even years at a time. It's about bringing people together who wouldn't necessarily have anything else in common by uniting them in concrete struggles against powerful opponents. It's about involving them in the strategic discussions that they have to make rather than directing them from above and giving them a sense of ownership over the decisions and the organizations that they're in. And then crucially, it's about winning, at least some of the time, because that is the kind of experience that actually has a chance of shifting identity. Really, a really difficult thing to do in a way that produces real change. And as that suggests, the most key thing about these goals is it turns out that they're deeply interdependent, right? On the one hand, collective action is most effective when participants are willing to make significant sacrifices to demonstrate their solidarity. On the other hand, participants are most likely to be transformed by experiences of collective action if those actions are actually successful at winning power. So you need the transformations in order to achieve the success, and you need the success in order to achieve the transformations. It has the appearance of a paradox, but I don't think it's really a paradox. I think it's more of a virtuous circle. In addition, I think that quantitative data about labor unions and community organizations can support some of these conclusions, but this is all in the background here. So the key message that I have, that I'll leave you with, is that if we're going to rescue democracy from oligarchic capture, we have to focus on this kind of partisan, intensive, oppositional practices of organized collective power, not the kind of stuff we're typically sold in the literature on what deeper democratization requires. If we don't, we'll never build the power that we need to stand a fighting chance against the oligarchs. But the good news is that we do have some sense of what works, and we do know what to do, and it is already happening around us in small scales. And just to illustrate that, I'll leave you with a story about an organization I learned about recently called the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, which successfully led a campaign to shut down two of the world's dirtiest coal plants, both of which happen to be in the same Mexican-American neighborhood in Chicago. The organization is led by Kim Wasserman, a Latina woman who got involved in environmental justice after her daughter was diagnosed with asthma. She's won many awards as an individual for her work, but she always attributes the success of her movement to this style of deep community organizing. It's worth noting a particularly stark contrast here with participatory budgeting in Chicago, which is used mainly to choose which streets are going to get paved in which year and so on. That's not what really mattered to the citizens of Little Village, but their concerns weren't going to get a hearing unless they forced policymakers to pay attention. And it took them over a decade, but in the end, organizing in this manner got the goods in the face of opposition from oligarchic elites who owned the coal power plants and certainly did not want to shut them down. So that's all, folks. Hopefully I haven't run too much over time. This is what I tried to tell you about today, and I look forward to hearing the comments from Naomi and Vlad to tell me why I'm wrong.
Thank you so much, Emma, for having me. Sam, it's great to see you. It's great to see this project in book form, and thank you so much for that presentation. So I've been invited today, speaking from my vantage point as a deliberative democratic theorist, in particular one who studies very intensively deliberative mini-publics. So I'm going to speak a bit about your critique of them and how it fits into this bigger picture of oligarchic fighting, and also how, and also thinking about it in conjunction with sort of your solution and the critiques of that. So I think that Professor Bagg brings a really compelling view of problems in our democracy, right? We have oligarchic takeover, there's mass inequality in terms of distribution of wealth, which translates very seamlessly to distribution of power. And in a democracy, what we really want is a equal distribution of power for many reasons. One of them is in particular, as Professor Bagg notes, is to make sure that public interests are paramount over private interests, and that there's a lot of corruptive problems of private interests when they supersede these public interests. And part of that, what I hear is this sort of critique of the ways in which participation, particularly through deliberative mini-publics, can play a role in trying to correct for that as a method of being an inclusive way for marginalized voices to participate in the system, insofar as the system excludes them due to this oligarchic takeover. So I think this is a great opportunity actually to ask some questions, because I'm going to talk a bit about mini-publics and ask some questions about this critique, because some of this critique has confused me for a long time and how I've heard it expressed by many critics of deliberative mini-publics. So I'm going to take a step back and talk just a tiny bit. I think you set them up very beautifully. Deliberative mini-publics are randomly selected groups of people asked to weigh in through moderated and debate, really deliberation on particular policy questions. Sometimes they're a bit broad, often they're a bit more specific in terms of thinking about things like how to redesign stadiums that were used for the Olympics so that they suit public interest, all the way to sort of, should we legalize abortion, as Ireland did. So we're going to talk about that in a bit. And they have been promised in a lot of different kinds of theories as a way to redistribute power again to people who wouldn't otherwise have been able to participate in the system, in part because they are invited into the institutions, they are paid for their time, they're given childcare, ideally time off work, things like that. They set up an environment for moderated and focused ideas from the people. And so my question about the critique of them is, as far as I've heard it from you, is that I've heard that they just kind of don't do enough, that because they can be susceptible either to takeover or they can just be disregarded. They can sort of be ignored, as happened in the French climate assembly case. So in that critique, I'm curious, because a lot of is the concern that the substance of them, that what they produce, isn't enough to counteract the work of the oligarchs. And so if we're worried about the substantive outcome, I have a different reading about the empirical literature on mini-publics as a particularly effective way to hear from people, to gain insight into what people want and think about systemic change, insofar as it relates to electricity policy, participatory budgeting, sort of prioritization. I study in particular things from the genetics world, things like gene editing and genetic testing, and sort of thinking about various rights and access claims. And they seem to be extraordinary places where people can really come together and think through collective decision making. So then, I suppose, is the concern that they come up with something really great, but then there's no real political incentive to take it up, in part because there's oligarchic takeover, and then the interests of the politicians were just sort of not will take over in those situations. So one response to that is, well, yes, that's a problem, and shouldn't that be why we reform the system in many ways that you mentioned, right? So if it is a problem that we're not hearing enough from these assemblies that are doing a good job in many ways, the French Climate Assembly had a rigorous amount of policy recommendations that really would have cut to a lot of climate change problems, such as banning sort of close, short-distance flights, requiring various measures that businesses take on in order to cut carbon emissions. Is the concern then that, why not have the solution, along with the rest of the solutions, be, well, we need to compel, we change the laws to have more of a compelling reason that politicians take up the mini-public requirements. So So that's one question. Then the other is, for as many examples kind of the French Climate Assembly, you have other examples where politicians did take them up. So the Irish Citizens Assembly is a beautiful example of this. It is the gold standards, it's everyone's favorite, but it's an easy one, so I'm going for it, right? So in the Irish Citizens Assembly, we have a case of a country that wanted sort of to retouch a lot of their policies in their country. And so they gathered a couple hundred of these people who met over a course of several weekends throughout a year, and they met with experts from both sides of various debates, and they decided that when it came to a lot of really hot-button issues in the country, a country that is predominantly conservative on a lot of very social issues, such as abortion, such as queer marriage, what they wanted to do was they wanted to put those decisions up to a public referendum, because they decided that these were important enough that people should be able to vote. And they voted overwhelmingly in favor of legalizing abortion and reproductive rights access and marriage equality. And so this is sort of a story of, and politicians did not get in the way, and despite the fact that these policies were illegal in the country largely because of what the politicians wanted, as opposed to what the people actually wanted. So this is a story of sort of the success of the ways in which people can use citizens' assemblies to garner not just decision-making through citizens' assemblies, but redistributing access to the people in the form of public referendum, which also Professor Bagg added as one of the ways in which people can have power but is quite limited. So in this case, it was quite expansive. Okay, so then there's the concern of, and this is a bit from your book, which is beautifully written, and really congratulations on this book. I think it's going to be a great addition to the democratic theory canon. But there's also this concern that's very prominent in many publics that they're going to be manipulated, that they're easily manipulatable, that this is part of oligarchic takeover, that you can sort of identify people within it, you can come in with money and sort of lobby the mini public in a similar way that you might lobby legislature or the bureaucracy, administrative regulators, things like that. And so I have two things to say to that. One is actually we see that happen in way less frequency within these groups. They're much more protected as you would protect jurors. It's sort of based on that model than we see in all these other realms. So actually the risk of that is way less. My second thought to this is that even if there was some risk to that, which of course there is, the fact that it's much less than elsewhere, wouldn't that suggest that it's still a promising pathway? Because it's an incremental improvement upon our system. And I agree with the diagnosis, right? We have this entrenched inequality, and we have this oligarchic takeover, et cetera. Any sort of bit of incremental change sounds really promising. And furthermore, many publics are not widely used, right? They are very much in the experimental phase, especially in the United States. We haven't really seen the deep impact that they could have. And so I think that the evidentiary standard for rejecting them isn't quite reached because we haven't seen them widespread use, and therefore we haven't really seen them widespread takeover and rejected. So there's still very much this promise of them. Okay, so that's my pitch for democratic mini publics, my critique of the critique. And then I want to say that the solution, that's sort of the promising solution instead in the form of organized labor and unions and collective decision-making, I worry falls victim to some of the similar critiques, right? So you have a lot of concern. First of all, of course they should happen. They are a democratic mobilization, grassroots organizing are a pillar of democratic equality, absolutely. But if we're going to reject many publics on the basis that I just outlined, I worry that we also might then need to reject some of the social movement organizing that was laid out as a solution. And part of the reason for that is that these are in order to be effective, a lot of these unions need an extremely large amount of resources and organizing capacity. That's important for them, and we should support them as such. But that does also mean that they become an organization where certain voices are able to have a voice and have the recognition and power because they are well-resourced and organized. This is part of the reason that many publics have often entered the picture, that a lot of people talk about when they're trying to select people for the mini public, not wanting representatives of stakeholder groups. That seems odd, right? Because these are well-organized groups. They have a lot of expertise. For example, I work in gene editing space. You might imagine you want representatives from disability rights organizations that have a lot to say about the ways in which gene editing might be used to marginalize their community. However, the goal of it is to capture a voice that isn't well-resourced, right, is part of the discussion in a robustly democratic way. So then when we have social movements and we have groups of people that are organizing really intensely, my worry is then that we have a sort of narrowing of interests. We have a particular block of people who have a specific interest. It may be very progressive, it may be very important for the furthering of distribution of resources, but is it going to be then become a sort of interest that only exists by virtue of the fact that it has resources, which sounds a bit like the kind of problem you want to avoid. So then I would say also about that, isn't it susceptible to manipulation and takeover in a particular kind of way? So I heard a lot about sort of wanting to avoid the directives from above and rather give ownership to the people from below. I don't think this always happens in these groups. It can happen, but I don't think it always does. And so it sounds like an ideal, but also there's a worry there, is it going to actually effectively do that? I also worry that is it going to achieve the kind of really intense redistribution that we're hoping that they will achieve? So the kind of chipping away, that time? Okay, so the kind of chipping away that is sort of that you argue, right, that many publics can only do, that maybe they can make kind of incremental progress. Is that also true for unions and sort of organized labor? Also, is it really going to achieve the kind of really mass demand that that democratic equality be freed from oligarchic rule? All right, thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I'm not a political theorist, so I want to bring some empirical evidence to bear some of these questions. And so, I really like the argument, I really like the book, and I think there's two parts of it. One is diagnosing the problem. Is the problem real? And I think one way to look at that is to measure policy and public opinion. And if there's oligarchic capture, we would think that public opinion is often not going to be matching. Majority opinion is not going to be matching what the policy is. And so we have, I think, the best data at the state level. And it turns out that public opinion and policy match about 55% of the time. And I think a nice benchmark for that is, how often would we expect to see policy congruence if we just made policy by coin flip? So heads, abortion is legal, tails, it's not. And so you would get the answer right about 50% of the time. So democracy works just a little bit better than a coin flip. It suggests, right, that all these things we do seem like they don't work. So I agree with Sam on that part of the argument. So the question is, given that democracy seems to be about as good as a coin flip, what's the mechanism? What's the problem? And Sam offers one explanation, which is oligarchic capture. And I think on that part, I think there's alternative explanations. And I want to offer one alternative model. That it's not my own. It's based on work by the former dean of the business school at Clemson, named Bruce DeAndle, and it's called the bootlegger and Baptist model of politics. And the motivating example, the apocryphal example, is why are there blue laws that regulate Sunday sales and ban Sunday sales alcohol in many places, including here in Ohio? And his argument is that most people don't care. Most people would love to have alcohol, but they just don't care. And there's two groups that really care. One is the bootleggers, who want to put the legal alcohol market out of business so they can sell illegally for profits. And one is the Baptists, who think that alcohol is a demon's rum and that it's outrageous that people would drink on the Lord's Day. And so in his story, you have the bootleggers team up with the Baptists, and the bootleggers say, well, if we're the face of this policy advocacy, no one's going to believe us. No one's going to be on the side of bootleggers. So we'll just give you the money, we'll give you the organizational resources, and you, the Baptists, be the public face, because you're doing it for the right reasons. And no one else was going to care. You're going to care, and you're going to persuade elected officials, and they're going to pass the policies that you want. And guess what? You're going to have policies that pretty much are out of sync with public opinion. And so I think the question is, I think Sam had some great examples. I think they match his model of oligarchic capture. But I think they also match very closely what you would predict from the bootleggers and Baptist model. And so is there an out-of-sample test? Is there other examples that are, I think, more consistent with one model than the other? And so let me just give you three that I think are much closer to the latter than the oligarchic capture. So San Francisco has really high housing prices. They have a very high rate of homelessness. And a few years ago, the city said, this is outrageous. These bastard developers, they're to blame. It's oligarchic capture. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go in the business of providing public housing. And so they approved a $300 million bond to build public housing. And they said, we're going to only go with nonprofit organizations, and we're going to have good quality public housing. And so the end result is it costs $1 million to build 1 unit of public housing in San Francisco, $1 million. So that $300 million the bonds they sold is going to build 300 units, which is going to be a drop in the bucket and have zero impact on housing affordability or homelessness in San Francisco. So there was a private sector contractor that looked at this data and said, well, this is outrageous. I can provide housing to San Francisco for a quarter of the price. I'll prefabricate the units. I'll ship them out to San Francisco. They can bolt them into place. I can do it under $250,000. He came to the city and he said, this is you have $300 million is going to go much farther. And the city wouldn't go for it because there was 3 groups that showed up. There was the Building Trades Council that showed up and said, well, you're going to go with this non-labor, non-organized, non-unionized contractor who's not going to have any apprenticeship programs for our union members. The environmentalists showed up and said, well, he's not going to have the most low-flow toilets and the greenest of appliances, and it's going to be outrageous. And the civil rights community showed up and said, well, he's not going to have 20% set-asides for minority contractors. And so the city said, you're right. We're not going to build more units to address the homelessness problem. We're going to keep going with the model we have now, which, again, turned out to be about $1 million per unit. So I think that's an example where policy is crazy. It doesn't match what people say they want, which is more affordable housing, less homelessness. But it's not a story of oligarchic capture. In fact, the very groups that are responsible for this disconnect, for the distortion, are the very groups that Sam says are the solution, the groups that are going to mobilize the masses and bring about better representation. So I want to offer another cautionary tale. I think maybe suggests that some of the solutions Sam proposes might backfire. And I know Sam said, the campaign finance is a small part of the story, and he's really not worried that much. But we do have, I think, great variation in efforts to try to address campaign finance. And we've had a number of cities and a number of states public financing designed to make candidates not rely on big donors. And it's a model that's very much based on grassroots mobilization. It's a matching model that you have to get a minimum number of small donors, like 1,000 small donors of $5 each. And then if you get to that amount, then we'll provide you public money to run for office, and then you won't be reliant on wealthy contributors. I think all the evidence we have is that the candidates who are publicly funded are crazy. Right? They're very extreme and they're very ineffective. And we see that at the state level and we see that at the local level in cities that have tried this, which suggests that maybe there's some other distortion, right? That being connected to the grassroots does not necessarily lead to better policy because there are people that have very strong preferences who are not oligarchs and have as much of a distortionary influence on the democratic process. And many of these things that mobilize those grassroots actually end up distorting policy even worse. So what is an alternative view? So I think the bootleggers and Baptist model is an analogy, but what are the underlying mechanisms that might explain the examples that Sam gives and the examples that I give? So I think there's 3, and I think they're very, very difficult to fix. One is it's actually really hard for elected officials to know what constituents want. So even if elected officials are sincerely motivated to do the right thing, and I think if we look at surveys, they say that the number one thing that drives their voting behavior in Congress is what their constituents want. But then you ask them, what do your constituents want? And you compare that to public opinion, they're massively out of whack. So it's actually really hard for an elected official to figure out what constituents want, and it's easily distorted by all sorts of groups that show up and tell all sorts of stories about why the community is on their side. And I think it's a very, very difficult problem to fix. I think the other is collective action, right? That we know that when there are concentrated costs and concentrated benefits, it's much easier to mobilize when there are diffuse costs and diffuse benefits. And most policies have some element of those, all of those. And inherently, there's going to be asymmetric mobilization. And it's very, very hard to overcome that asymmetric mobilization, that diffuse benefits and diffuse costs are going to be just much less effective. And those people are going to be much more likely to stay at home, regardless of the amount of mobilization that you do. And I think the last, and I think this is where the solutions I think are particularly important, is status quo bias. Right? The American political system makes it really, really easy to block policy change. And I worry that some of the suggestions about decentralizing power actually make that worse because they create more opportunities for vested interests, whether oligarchic interests or some other vested interests, to block policy change. And so let me end on one last example that I think illustrates, I think a great example, again, where I think the oligarchic capture story doesn't work, but also shows maybe the downside, shows the unintended consequence of the grassroots mobilization. And I think that example is gun control. So if you look at public opinion on a policy like, let's say, background checks for guns, 90% support. Blue states and red states everywhere. So everybody wants stricter background checks. And yet, we don't have stricter laws, and every effort to pass strict laws has not worked. And so there has been, in the last couple of decades, some very high-profile shootings in Connecticut and Florida. And there has been a lot of grassroots advocacy. So you have the Brady Center, you have the Gifford Center, and certainly after the Connecticut shooting and the Parkland shooting in Florida, you had real mobilization. And the result of that mobilization, I think in some ways, is very scary. So two things happen when there's a high-profile shooting, and the president comes out and says, we got to do something about gun control. One is gun sales go way up, because all the people are worried that the government's going to make it harder to buy guns, so they buy the guns now. A lot of those are first-time gun owners that don't lock them up. Those guns get stolen, they get used in accidental shootings, and so gun crimes go up. And second, you see a wave of policy introductions. So all sorts of states introduce bills on guns. And there's a really nice paper that came out a few years ago in the Journal of Public Economics that shows that when you have mass shootings, which are actually account for a fraction of a percent of all shooting deaths, but anytime there's a mass shooting covered by the media, bill introductions go up across the board. The vast majority of those bills never pass. And so what you see after this mobilization on behalf of gun control is in blue states, tons of introductions to make guns harder to buy and to keep, and all those bills fail because of the asymmetric mobilization, because of the status quo bias, maybe because also of misperception of public opinion, and we have really good data on that. And what you see in the red states is most of those bills fail, a few pass, and all those bills make it easier to own guns. They actually move in the opposite direction, in part because the gun owners are so terrified, and they counter-mobilize, and they are much more effective. And that's, I don't think, a story of oligarchic capture. The NRA is broke because all the NRA board members stole all the money. The gun manufacturers are, I think, a relatively small part of the economy. So that cannot be explained by a story of rich oligarchs. That's a story, I think, of, again, vested interests, including grassroots interests, and the story of counter-mobilization in the face of mobilization, and one of those, I think, being much more effective. And so I worry that the story from the, I think, gun example, I think, is a cautionary tale, right, of what happens when you try to mobilize the community. Well, there's going to be a response, and because we haven't solved the inability to actually figure out which group is the right representative of the masses, because we haven't necessarily addressed the inherent collective action problems that make it harder for one side to mobilize than the other, and because we haven't addressed the status quo bias, I think mobilization by itself could do more harm than good because of the counter-mobilization that comes with it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Sam, Vlad, and Naomi. I want to make sure we have lots of time for audience questions, so I'm not going to pose too many questions to our panelists, but I do want to give Sam somewhat of a chance to respond to things that Vlad and Naomi raised. And so maybe I can frame it in this way. I think all three panelists brought up a really interesting mixture of empirical and normative questions. Right? So thinking about that three-part division of his argument that Sam gave us, first of all, claiming that the American state is pervasively captured by oligarchic elites. Second, that existing mechanisms for responding to this problem are insufficient or too easily captured by the same elites. And third, that this alternative model of organizing for power will do better. So some of the questions you've heard Vlad and Naomi raise press on that empirical account, right? What explains the lack of congruence that we see between policy outputs and public opinion, or perhaps policy outputs and the public interest, as Sam might have it? How susceptible are many publics to manipulation and capture? And can organizing for power do better, or will it be vulnerable to some of the same dynamics that we've already identified? So those all seem to be questions about sort of cause and effect, the effects of different changes that we might try to make. But we've also seen some normative questions, I think, raised, and they've been a little bit implicit, so I just want to foreground them a bit. One is, how seriously do we weigh the risk of capture compared to other problems that might afflict democracy? right? So if we accept that some measure of oligarchic capture is occurring, do we treat that as the most important threat to democracy today, or might other risks like polarization be more serious? And that might matter for how we treat some of the risks of your contestatory approach to these problems, right? If polarization is an existential threat to democracy, then the more collaborative approach of participatory inclusion could start to look more attractive. Or think again about the organizing model you recommend. Some people might worry that that threatens to further politicize other domains of life. Is that a risk that we need to worry about? So what I'd like to ask each of you, just quickly before we start involving the audience in the questions more, is what do you take to be the most important question at issue in this debate? Is it an empirical question or a normative one? And if it's an empirical one, which? Sort of what's the question that we don't yet know the answer to that could shift your opinion on these issues? Or do you think that some of the disagreements between you are fundamentally about questions of value and how we prioritize different democratic threats?
Yeah, great questions, Emma. So you've asked me to choose between two options that are sort of both true, right? So how is it the empirical questions or the normative questions? I mean, I guess if I did have to choose, probably the empirical questions, because I don't think that we probably don't disagree ultimately that much about whether there's a problem, and maybe slightly disagree on how serious it is compared to other ones, but I think we're probably on the same page there. And even if we do disagree normatively on that, it's probably has its roots in empirical questions about what organizing is likely to do to something like polarization. My view is that yes, of course there are worries about that, but I think there are also ways in which greater organizing in the ways that I talk about in favor would actually help that problem as well, at least in the long run. So that's, so I do tend to think that a lot of our disagreements in political theory more generally that masquerade as normative disagreements actually have a lot of empirical content, and so, or often unstated. And so I think it's good that it's coming out here as empirical disagreement. I think I'll stop there, yeah.
Ooh. That's a great question. So is it okay if I draw a bit from the book? Because I think this is a really good way of phrasing your argument, which is that Sam has a self-described sort of realist approach to democratic theory insofar as look, we've got this problem of democracy, which is oligarchic capture, and the goal is just get rid of it. Before we can even talk about, is this fair, disagreements and how to sort through collective disagreements, we need to not have the 0.01 percenters in charge. And I think that is, I totally agree. I think that a lot of our normative questions are empirical questions. So I'm going to say yes and yes. And I think that maybe part of the disagreement there is, don't we also still care about sort of how to resolve disagreement, given we live together in a world in which sometimes you have to choose one thing or the other in terms of how to distribute resources or policy approaches. And I guess the way that I think about sort of the oligarchic problem is, that seems like the first, the problem that stands in the way of getting to real deepening democratic commitments, and that those democratic commitments we need to still keep our eyes on, and it can't just stop at sort of oligarchic removal, which is why we need to include lots of different kinds of voices, different points of entry, because even if they're not going to completely redesign the system for us, they're going to have an effect on people's lives, much like organizing, right? So with Amazon, it's very much the case that you unionize one warehouse. No, it's not going to solve oligarchic capture. It's going to have a lot of problems, similar to a lot of many public problems which are my critique, but it is going to give people at that warehouse a better life, so it's still really important. We can achieve both.
I think our disagreements are entirely empirical. I think maybe there's folks who are deliberative democracy scholars who will also disagree on the normative, and they might say the value of the deliberative institutions is not just to improve policy, but actually for the for the participants themselves, and they become better citizens. But I'm not necessarily in that camp. So I think my disagreement is entirely empirical on two fronts. One is on diagnosing the problem. How much of it is oligarchic capture versus how much of it is capture by other vested interests and other people with extreme preferences that are not representative. And I think it's much more the latter than the former, and I think the oligarchic capture is a subset of that, and explains a subset of the policy issues, including, I think, all the examples that Sam so powerfully illustrated. But I think that's just, again, a particular variety of a broader problem that is not necessarily going to be solved by just addressing the oligarchs. I think the second is the empirical disagreement on the causal effects of the reforms that are proposed. And I think that, again, the disagreement is on two fronts. One is, what is the actual impact of those reforms? Does it match the idealistic, hopeful model that I think Sam provides in the book? And again, my sense is I'm much more skeptical. And the second, even if that account is correct, they are at best, I think, partial equilibrium effects, right? That even if those reforms work, there's going to be a response from the vested interests and from the crazy people and from the people that have very strong preferences. And so even if the reforms work in the partial equilibrium sense, it's not obvious to me that the general equilibrium result is going to be better, I think, as the gun example illustrates, where there is real mobilization, but the end result is potentially policy that's even more misaligned. So it's really on those three fronts, three empirical fronts, that I think our disagreement mostly lies.
Great. Well, so just to do justice to Sam's book here, he's talking about oligarchic capture in part because I asked him to. I told him we wanted to do an event on money and politics. The book itself contains an account of a broader category he calls state capture, which is when the state and policy is captured by partial or factional interests. So oligarchs are a really important category of that, but they're not the only one, and it's consistent to think other kinds of capture are possible. So maybe this is the last question I'll ask Tim before we open it up to the audience. How do you think about cases where you could have overlapping accounts of capture? So something like education policy. Is it captured by Bill Gates? Is it captured by teachers' unions? And if the answer is some version of both, how do we prioritize different kinds of factional interest over policy when we're looking to address capture?
Yeah, that's great. And I think that does get at a lot of the kind of texture of the response that I would want to give to some of the concerns that were raised. So, because I do think clearly capture by other forces is possible, not just possible, but common, right? That's definitely the case. And certainly capture of unions by unions and other movements is also a thing that is also common, right? So it's important to say that, at least half of my argument in that chapter where I'm talking about this is against certain kinds of unions and certain kinds of movement organizations and certain kinds of activism which don't have the characteristics that I think are most important. Partly because those characteristics help to avoid capture of those institutions. But, right. So I guess the way I think about it is, we do have to ultimately take a kind of normative look at the overall picture. And if you see all those things that I listed, the trillions of dollars spent here and trillions of dollars spent there, and the way the just insane inequality that exists, and you think the real problem is, San Francisco spent too much on each unit of housing in order to achieve certain other goals that seem not that crazy, like supporting unions and civil rights and so on. Like, that's the real problem. That maybe that is a normative disagreement. I think the real problem is that, we spend trillions of dollars subsidizing fossil fuels and, finance and all these other people who have way, way too much power and money in the world. And, yes, probably they could have done this building more efficiently, but is that the main problem in the world? No, I don't think so. And so, I'm willing to accept that, of course, if we lean into unions and community organizing and so on, some of that's going to go wrong. Some of that's going to go, some of that's going to become capture in itself. But I think that is the direction that we need to go in. And they're relatively less, I think, for certain internal characteristics that especially well-organized unions and organizations have. There are certain characteristics that are going to make them relatively less susceptible to capture than some of the others. So the oppositional character, the involvement of sort of the sustained character over time, where there are multi-level connections between people, and the hierarchical structures, right? I think those can make it less likely that there's going to be the kind of capture that I'm worried about overall. So I think that is what I would say. I mean, certainly all the problems that you both have raised are there, but I think when we're talking about how to fix democracy, we have to think about the overall question of what should we be focusing our attention on? What deserves the most? We're in a bad situation. Like, we have limited resources. Where do we put them? For me, the argument is about we need to put them in countervailing power, because the biggest problem, the most pervasive problem by far is this one, the problem of oligarchic capture. And of course, when we're fixing the problem, we need to worry about all the other kinds along the way so that we don't get caught up. But that's the kind of first question, and I think it needs to receive a much more attention in democratic theory and democratic practice.
Well, I have many more questions, and maybe I'll insert myself again later, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask theirs, either for Sam or for our other panelists. Yeah, Sahar. Oh, yeah, sure, that'd be great. Sorry, we have microphones.
Thank you so much for the great talk and great comments. The way that I understand your argument is something like the following, that we have like a landscape of power, let's say, and you have organized power on one side, oligarchy, that is changing every other checks and balances that we had to like maintain some rough equality in social interactions. And then what we should do is to create a counterweight that would like flatten this space a little bit more, right? And I love that picture. I love the reliance on even social movements to bring, give more power and organization to people who are affected by this kind of imbalance. What I am puzzled by is that statement that you had at the end, that you think instead of focusing on X, Y, and Z, we should focus on this particular thing. And I think, at least the way I see it, this particular thing alone will not ever generate that kind of, or easily generate that kind of counter weight. One reason for what Naomi said, that, well, they can be captured too. But another thing is that, like, these movements or organizations, they're, one of their interesting features is that they can disseminate some kind of value or behavior or kind of preferences in ways that like can intervene at different levels, right? Not at the level of policy, for instance, at the level of social norms, at the level of like, I don't know, putting social pressures or like things like that. But also, like, sometimes they strategically realize that you're better off cooperating with, like, government, let's say, or using the already existing dynamic to, like, spread the change and let this be a stable kind of counterweight, right? So what I was kind of confused by was, like, why you are kind of booing every other way, that like it seems like for these organizations even to work, they need to rely on that mobilization. They need to rely on that kind of mass movements that are not as like organized and well structured. They need to rely on state power. They need to rely on so many things to like let themselves be more established and use this kind of topography of the power landscape. And you want to say, like, don't pay attention to any of those things, just hyper-focus on this one. If something doesn't have these kind of features, it's not gonna work, we're done. And what I'm missing, that doesn't help me see your point.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so if I, maybe I came on too strong there in the way that I presented that. I mean, I don't mean to say that mobilization, for instance, is not important. I was putting it as a contrast because people often confuse the two, and I think often think that they're doing organizing when they're actually doing mobilizing, and it's important to maintain that the special importance of organizing. Not that mobilizing isn't important, but it's limited in important ways that organizing is fills the gap that needs to be filled, and I think. So part of it is just kind of distinguishing this as a sort of unique set of strategies, and I think strategies that are particularly important and particularly missing, particularly not present in America today and many other contexts, which is partly why oligarchic capture is so strong. I mean, in terms of other, other forms of, citizens' assemblies and mini publics and again, like, maybe for effect, I sort of exaggerate what, the rejection here. I don't reject the idea we should never pay attention to these, we should, right? I think what we need to do is be a lot more careful about what we're saying, what we think their purpose is, and how we design them to be most relevant. And I think we need to not let that be the bulk of our attention in seeking democracy, not overstate what it can do, and put it in a proper context. So both of those things, I think, run against the trends that I see in democratic theory and also in democratic practice. And I think there's a reason for that, which is that those methods, especially when oligarchs and others, elite interests have a role in constructing those practices, they don't really threaten elite interests. And so, if we're thinking of that as like the main event of deepening democracy, which I think many people do, that's a problem. And so I'm trying to push back against that. What I see happening.
I'm going to jump in. I thought that was clarifying and really interesting. And also to relate to what you were saying before about, sort of, we might have critiques here, we might have critiques here and agreements here, but ultimately it comes down to what do we want to accomplish first? Like, that's sort of a statement not just of practicality, we only have so much time, but also a statement of our prioritization and commitments. So I think it's really helpful. But I don't think that in this case, we need to choose. Like, I think in this case, we have a huge systemic problem, and we should probably throw at it whatever we can. And in particular, if we're thinking about sort of distribution of resources and time and allocation, these are operating in different worlds, these kinds of interventions. Deliberative mini-publics, again, we haven't really seen them systemically used or full-blown in the United States yet, but as they've been used as citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries and participatory budgeting, and also citizens' initiative reviews, right, which is where people collect information about candidates, and it has become a much more neutral place to find information about candidates. Anyway, they are state operated, right? So you might have a state, the government, actually finance them. So then that comes from that money, whereas mobilization, organizing efforts are not. Right, so you can have an argument. So this is my argument in a different project. My argument, and this is actually the one you saw at APT. Right, this is where you have these are it's mutually advantageous to think about them as in coordination in one system, and they can come from different pools of money. We don't have to choose. Wouldn't that be nice?
So I'll just say when we don't have to choose, that's great. But I think there are certain circumstances where we do. If you think about just the case of Chicago, participatory budgeting versus the Environmental Justice Organization, many of those people who were involved in one might have spent their time instead in the other, and many of the people and there are, they only have so much time to choose, and so I think it is choice of strategic, it can be a choice of strategies for individuals and for organizations. So I think, I don't think we're disagreeing that much, but that's just what I'd say, and I'll stop there, sorry.
Would you like to either come up to the mic, maybe? Or?
Hello, I'm Morgenthal from Germanic Languages and Literatures. So I have a question that's not fully fleshed out, but I want to understand who thinks that oligarchy is a problem, because Kogan said maybe he actually thinks it's not a problem, and then you think you want to fix it, and that people need to have a chance to fix this problem. And I'm just wondering where the focus needs to be. You can organize, but what do people actually think, and how do you know what people actually think? But if you think of healthcare, this is something maybe I can somehow relate to. So if you say there's an oligarchy problem in healthcare in America, costs are really high compared with other countries, and there's a lot of power there. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't allow bargaining about prices, even though that's changing of their medications. So is there, in public opinion, do people worry about this? Because, I'm from Germany, and we have a very different system. There's, of course, Europe has very different systems in healthcare. But do people worry about this? Or do people think in America, the majority, well, actually it's fine if people who have a lot of money have a lot of power. I mean, is there really perception that that's a problem? And if there's not a problem, I mean, I'm just thinking where the chicken and egg is. I mean, don't you have to educate the people first to see that there's a problem, and maybe they don't think that there's a problem?
Yeah, so here's where I'm a bit of a heretic in democratic theory, in that I don't take whatever the people happen to think at this moment when they're asked, in a poll or whatever, as the gold standard for what democracy means. I think democracy means the set of institutions and practices that protect the public interest, and I happen to think it is a problem. And so I think, yes, I wouldn't call it education, I would call it organizing. That's what organizing does. Organizing builds the kind of knowledge, it allows people to see what's actually going on, and recognize the harms that the capture is doing. People don't know about this stuff, and they don't know how it affects them, and if they, it is based on some kind of counterfactual that if they recognize this stuff better and they had better opportunities to fight it and so on, that they would care about it more. But it does not, this view does not take sort of whatever public opinion happens to be right now as the absolute end-all of what democracy means. So I think that answers your question.
Can I jump in really fast? So I have to sneak out in 2 minutes for my class about health policy. So this is a perfect example. And so just to be clear, I don't disagree that oligarchic capture is a problem, certainly in the examples that Sam gave. I think it's a subset of a broader phenomenon. And I think I guess if we were to think about it in terms of root causes, I think the root causes is not the oligarchy or the concentration of wealth. I think it's the political mechanisms that allow either people that have vested financial interests, but also people that have vested ideological interests to have disproportionate representation. And I think healthcare is a great example because Sam had an example of pharmaceutical prices, right? He had the Keytruda, one of these blockbuster cancer drugs. And it's true that in the United States we pay way more for pharmaceutical drugs than most of the world. And one response is, well, if the government can only negotiate. But I think what's interesting is the government sets prices for doctors under Medicare and has since 1960s. The government sets prices for hospitals under Medicare. That's completely government set, and yet we still pay far more for doctors, including through Medicare and the private insurers that base their reimbursements on Medicare, and also for hospitals. And I think government stepping in and trying to negotiate prices hasn't worked because that process has gotten captured by these very same groups. Some of them are oligarchs, and some of them are nonprofit hospitals who say, we're here for the community, and you can't reduce our reimbursements because then we won't be able to treat the poor, and those arguments are really effective. And so I think that it's a great example of where it's not just the oligarchs, it's broader interest groups, it's broader interests that are shaping policy in a way that at the end leads to a system where we end up paying way more for healthcare than the rest of the world, and where I think the solutions are really difficult, because it's not obvious to me what the policy lever is to address that. And so with that, I'm going to sneak out. Thank you.
I'm going to be slightly unorthodox and ask you to thank Sam and Vlad and Naomi now while Vlad's still here. Thank you, Vlad. But we do have time for a couple more questions for the other panelists. Yeah.
So I think in the broad strokes with your main messaging, I really agree. But at the same time, I'm thinking about that it makes more sense for me, this type of grassroots movement at the local level. I see that being a lot more effective because when I think about the democratic world in the recent years, if we see the most successful grassroots movement, those that have really reached en masse to the most people, they frequently devolved into like dangerous forms of populism or focused on culture war politics more than like actual substantive policy measures, and are easily also co-opted by the political elites for their own gain. So I'm wondering if your research addresses that at all, basically.
Yeah, that's a great question because for me, I think I actually don't use the word grassroots because I think it conveys, not that I don't think things that are often called grassroots can be good, but it gives an impression that it's entirely bottom up. And I don't think that organizing that I'm talking about is entirely bottom up. It's partly bottom up and it's partly, like the thing that's distinctive about it is that it is not a unmediated connection between mass publics and elite champions, right? That's what populist politics of the dangerous kind tends to look like. the kind of organizing I'm talking about has structures that are in some sense hierarchical, but have feedback between that goes both ways, right? Top down and bottom up. And it's because it is easiest to see and easiest to imagine on the local level because it's very difficult to integrate it across all these scales. But I think it does, it is possible, it does happen that local organizations, there basically has to be a kind of local foundation in order for this to work, because there has to be those face-to-face connections, those human scale kinds of connections between the people that are involved and then the sort of various levels of mid-level elites that are kind of carrying things back and forth up and down the scale. And that, I think, is what distinguishes the kinds of things I'm talking about from what I would see as the more worrying forms of supposedly grassroots mobilization that is in fact really right, that kind of plebiscitary mass direct unmediated connection, right? It's all about the mediation for me, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe building on that last question, since all of us on the panel are privileged to work at great public universities, I'm interested in how you think about the role of the university in this story. Is capture a problem there to any significant degree? And if so, is there an appropriate role or maybe appropriate limits to the role of universities in addressing it?
I haven't thought about this very much. I probably should. I think there's obviously a role for knowledge building and creation and for connections between universities and people in universities and the people who are building movements. Universities, obviously there's capture of universities. In a way, maybe in the grand scheme of things, I feel like they're still doing good on the whole, and that it's kind of remarkable actually that we have these things. Given all the other ways in which capture and oligarchic interests just rule, like the idea that like the norm is for all elite, for most people to try aspirationally to send their kids to places where they're going to be educated by a bunch of people who like basically think and on the whole think liberal, progressive, left things. Like that's a social reproduction system that we've chosen in this capitalist society. Like that's kind of amazing. And it's like important not to lose that perspective because it doesn't have to be that way, and certain people are trying to make it not that way anymore. And so in addition to all the problems, I think it's important to recognize that is something.
Yeah, I also hadn't thought too much about the university, but I mean, yes, there's capture for sure. There's entrenched, economic interests, and there's, that plays out absolutely in institutions with lots of money everywhere. I will answer that in sort of, I study in particular regulatory capture, and I in particular study the ways in which deliberative mini-publics can be helpful in that arena. And so this actually gets to the healthcare question, which is that the conversation in regulatory capture is very interesting because it's the kind of concept where it sounds really bad, but then there's some inevitability to capture insofar as capture is this sort of close relationship between big moneyed interests and stakeholders. And when it comes to regulations, that's almost inevitable because you need some sort of relationship between the regulators and the regulated in order to know what's happening in the market, know what the products are, and think about evidence and safety and all these goals of public interest. And so because there's these closer relationships, there's capture there. But then it's sort of, when does that capture become nefarious insofar as it takes over the public good? And that's sort of the hard line to try and figure out. And I think that happens also probably in the university, which is why it's a hard question. It's a great question, it's hard.
Pierce.
So I think the thing would love for you to speak to, just to help me understand a little bit better, is like the Tea Party and the MAGA movement and how they fit into what you're talking about, because it seems like they've been very successful through using political levers to achieve some ends, and their narrative is an anti-elite narrative, And so I'm just wondering, like on your account, is that actually the whole movement is actually captured in some way because Trump put through these tax cuts, or, but that's definitely not how I think a lot of people in the movement think of themselves. And so I'm just sort of curious, given their success, do you see them as like a kind of a model? Is it the political levers that they seem to have been so successful with, both within the party to like establish control through primaries, but also using other kinds of levers? I guess I just really not getting how you think of them either as a model or not as a model, and where they come into the whole story. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think the wrong lesson that we can learn from that experience is that anti-elite rhetoric is bad. I think there's, it's too facile to say like, oh, it's really just about economic interests, and they, if Bernie had won in 2016, then they wouldn't have gone to Trump, and et cetera. But there's something true, behind that caricature, which is that anti-elite rhetoric is being wielded in a very powerful way by those organizations. But I think, in a way, yeah, it's the effect of it is to perpetuate the power of at least some elites, especially the oligarchic elites. So, of course, people in the movement don't see themselves that way. They don't use that in that way. But what's happened is that these movements have succeeded in building identities, political identities that are very strong and very deeply felt and very impactful and very widespread, that pit themselves against what they see as the elite, which is the kind of liberal university establishment and so on. And so I think the challenge is to build different kinds of identities. And I don't think you're necessarily going to get people who are fully in that category to completely switch sides, but there are a lot more people who may be up for grabs, and who, a couple stories that I talk about in the book are from the teacher strikes in 2018. There's a great book called Red State Revolt, because these teacher strikes were in West Virginia, Arizona, one other state, maybe it's Kentucky, but I think it was Arkansas. Anyway, red states. And there were many people who got involved in these movements who voted for Trump, et cetera, who came to these collective struggles because of their shared interests with others who were leading the organizations, and they really found themselves changed. Their political identities changed through this experience of fighting. They sort of saw exposed, laid bare the problems of what, in this case, it wasn't necessarily oligarchs. It was just state governments that didn't want to fund education and so on. But they found, they found common cause in fighting these enemies, and their political identities, their sort of racial attitudes and so on, demonstrably shifted through these processes. And that's not just something that happened, in a couple of anecdotes there. There's recent work coming out showing how, even unions in general, which, as I said, many unions are not using the practices that I'm talking about, but just being a union member, shifts, white people's racial attitudes in a very progressive direction. The effects are pretty remarkable. So that kind of thing that's the task, is to mobilize, is to organize those people, shift their identities in ways that are going to facilitate rather than obstruct democracy.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for coming out and listening to this discussion. You don't need to hurry away. We have cookies and coffee at the back of the room, and handsome display copies of a wonderful book at the front. But please join me again in thanking Sam Bagg for talking about his arguments, and Naomi Schneiderman for opening the discussion.